Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the two remarkable cases, I think, of senior members of the government breaking ranks with Boris Johnson, and without trying to read too much into it, wondering if it's a little bit of political positioning ahead of an anticipated change of leadership in the party and, of course, in the government. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news in politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, this week we've had two big breaks from the hitherto close-knit group at the top of government. Earlier this week we had Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, saying that she had argued for border controls at the start of the COVID crisis back in March and that she was overruled by the Prime Minister Boris Johnson. This is effectively pinning the blame on Johnson for the catastrophic death toll, and I want to talk about that a little bit more later in the video. But we also had a row blow up yesterday as a result of a policy that Matt Hancock once enacted to help deal with COVID, and it was widely reported in the press to the point where you would think that it was about to become official policy, it was about to be put in place, and only it was not. And apparently Boris Johnson, or at least those close to him, not best pleased. Now, you do get tensions within government. That's quite normal. Government, even well-run government, is about compromise. You know, sometimes it's obvious what the best thing is to do, but when you think about all the things the government have to do and, you know, the best thing to do in each case isn't always feasible, it's perfectly normal for cabinet ministers who are in charge of a department to want a thing, you know, a policy, because they think it's in the best interests of their department, to be told no, because either it conflicts with policy elsewhere, you'd be treading on the toes of another department, or the Treasury can't prioritise the cash for it. It's like, well, you know, there's so much money, we're prioritising this. What you want, yeah, it'd be brilliant, but it costs a load of money. We'd rather spend that money on something else. In the case of the current government, of course, that is always Tory donors. And sometimes those tensions do spill over into the media. For example, imagine yourself, you're the head of a department, you're a Secretary of State, and you might be so convinced that your idea is really in the public interest, or it's a really good idea, that you try and pitch it, but, you know, the Chancellor's having none of it because of the money, or the Prime Minister's having none of it because of, you know, the interplay between that policy and policies in other departments. So what you do is you leak this idea to try and get wider public support. So that does happen now and then, but this is a government that has given the impression as being as thick as thieves. They all back each other. You know, all of these senior ministers, they were chosen just for their blind loyalty to Brexit and to Boris Johnson. They had to give Johnson and Dominic Cummings through last year their total support, and in return, Johnson did the same for them. Several of them have failed so badly that they could have been sacked several times over. Under any other Prime Minister of any other party, they would have been. Priti Patel several times should have been sacked this year. Gavin Williamson several times. Matt Hancock. Dominic Raab has not done anything particularly to be sacked, but he's also not been all that beneficial. But they hang on because of this covenant, this pact between themselves. Because quite frankly, Boris Johnson should have been ousted several times as well. So it's a genuine surprise to me to hear of not just one, but two public rows, public distancing at the very top of government. So taking them one at a time, yesterday morning, the front pages of almost every newspaper seem to be full of this idea of a flat £500 if you test positive for COVID. The idea is to tackle the single biggest problem we have right now, according to public health experts, namely that people aren't getting tested. It's estimated that of the people who should be getting tests, only about 17% are. So people aren't being tested, or in a small numbers of cases where they are being tested and they test positive, they're still turning up to work for whatever reason, but mostly, and certainly the most understandable reason, is because they cannot afford statutory sick pay. They wouldn't be able to pay the bills. They can't afford to do that. And actually that's why most aren't getting the test at all. They're imagining being tested positive and thinking, well, I can't afford to be off work, so they just don't get the test. And they excuse it in their own heads, a bit of a cough or a bit of a cold, whatever. Because the problem is our statutory sick pay is embarrassingly low compared to, other European countries. So the idea of this flat £500 is to allow people to pay the bills if they test positive for COVID and have to self-isolate. It's be able to say, well, look, you use this, you can pay your bills. Now, I don't know whether it's the best policy. I don't even know whether it's good enough. But it definitely at least addresses the problem that public health experts have been screaming about for half a year now. I suspect the best policy is just to increase statutory sick pay, but you can imagine how that's playing. It's like, well, then people would get this higher rate of statutory sick pay for just being sick with something else. We want to target COVID. And that, I guess, is Matt Hancock's idea. Now, the headlines did talk about it being a plan. They didn't say this is definitely coming, but it was blown up so much that you could easily be forgiven for thinking that this is about to happen. It's a plan about to be put into operation. And it was almost everywhere. There was papers on the left and the right. There's the ones that continually fail to report the problems with COVID, as well as the ones that do. It just seemed to be across the spectrum. And as it wasn't on the front page of absolutely every paper, but it was on most of them enough to have covered the bulk of distribution. It was also covered on the BBC News. So a lot of people would have heard about this. This is newsworthy. This has got about. This is very discussion worthy. Then I see an article in The Sun. This is the Murdoch-owned rag that is banned in much of Liverpool. I like Liverpool. But this article said that those close to Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, and Boris Johnson have attacked this plan in no uncertain terms. And the leak, they've really been annoyed about this leak. So they're a little bit annoyed that it's out in public. And I think you can see why. Because it would not only be... What this plan would be is a potentially valuable contribution to the pandemic effort. And it would meet with widespread public approval, you would think. So now if they don't do it, and they're really not minded to do this, then when the cost of that inaction is factored in, a bit like, not closing the old borders last year, fingers will be pointed. And the same article also said that this leak came as a complete shock to Downing Street. They were blindsided by it, they said. And this is the base of operations, of course, for both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. And this just reads like a classic case of a minister trying to force Downing Street's hand by making it politically damaging to shut it down. Because now that it's out there, a lot of questions will be asked if the government don't do this. Questions will be asked. And then we had Priti Patel's remarks last week, so questions were already asked about this. So she said that she argued for the borders to be closed last March. She's saying that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, overruled her. Now, a couple of things to consider here. One, we don't know whether or not she actually did argue for this. She could just be saying it. What she may have argued for it, and she may have been overruled. What is absolutely clear is that the Prime Minister certainly argued against it because it didn't happen. The fact that it didn't happen was ultimately down to Boris Johnson. The second thing to consider is, so, okay, whether or not Priti Patel genuinely did argue for it last March or not, why is she only saying this now? Why is she now letting it be known? Why didn't she let it be known 10 months ago that she wanted the borders closed? Why didn't this come out then? Now, if you take both of these thoughts into account, alongside Matt Hancock's antics, what we're seeing is a bit of friction between senior government ministers and the head of the government. Now, let me put forward a bit of a hypothesis. So let us imagine, just hypothetically, let us say there was growing belief that Boris Johnson will not be Prime Minister by the end of the year. At some point this year, he's leaving. He may not even be Prime Minister beyond the end of summer. Now, it could be that he actually intends to resign. There was an awful lot of talk last year about him potentially resigning, round about spring this year, in order to earn some more money as a newspaper gobshite again, because, he can't afford a nanny, and people close to him are saying, do you know what, his kid needs to go to Eton, that's 42 grand a year. I mean, a Prime Minister's salary is not really stretching that far, poor lamb. It might be that. Or maybe there's a growing rebellion against him on the backbenchers. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily know other than the very obvious signs. Doesn't matter. Let's say that is their belief. They think his time is coming to an end. Now, Boris Johnson may well just leave as Prime Minister and go off to do his newspaper stuff, may even resign as an MP. But these guys are not ready to leave frontline politics yet. They've got much more money to make. COVID has been deeply damaging. And you know, they don't want to be taking the blame for that themselves. Boris Johnson's government will take a heap of blame for that, quite rightly. They don't want to share in that blame. And they also don't want to lose their influence amongst the next government that forms. They still want a top job. So Patel tries to say that, you know, mistakes were made, but it wasn't my mistakes, because actually I argued for the correct policy. You know, I mean, she's the Home Secretary, very senior member of the government. You may not think there's a lot to do with the pandemic in that, but there is. There's the policing of it. But although this is where the borders idea comes in, border control would be very much part of her department. So it makes sense for her to claim that she wanted those borders closed. She was overruled. Matt Hancock, of course, had a very obvious major role in our response because he was Health Secretary. So he may want to give the impression that he also had really good ideas to deal with the problem that were also undermined from senior members of the government. If he'd been supported, it would have been so much better. And I think that's what this is. You know, it just sounds like, you know, he's got this in the press to try and strong arm some action from the Treasury to introduce this £500. To be honest, I don't think that's it. I think he just wants to have it publicly known that he has policy ideas that would help that are being overruled. I think it's the same thing as Priti Patel's in a sneakier way, you know, so that he can later on claim that Sunak and Johnson were undermining him all the time, overruling better policy decisions. You know, he'd suggested following the expert advice and they'd overrule him. As a loyal Conservative, of course, he did his best to make it work, but at the end of the day, you can't make a silk purse out of a pig's scrotum. And the fact that this is happening now, it's like twice in 1 week, and we haven't seen this before. It's not just that it's 2 occasions in 1 week. We haven't seen any examples of any sort of discord amongst the top of government. We haven't seen this in public like this. And it just, when it follows on from that very public threat to Johnson's leadership that was issued by prominent backbencher Steve Baker recently, it just makes you wonder if the big players in the parliamentary party are just positioning themselves for a change of leadership. Because I'll tell you what they're not doing. They're not positioning themselves to defend against a reshuffle, because the last thing you want to do if it's a reshuffle you're worried about is to piss off the Prime Minister. But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.